A reading from Luke chapter 10, verses 38 to 42. While Jesus and his disciples were traveling, Jesus entered a village where a woman named Martha welcomed him as a guest. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his message. By contrast, Martha was preoccupied with getting everything ready for their meal. So Martha came to him and said, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to prepare the table all by myself? Tell her to help me." And the Lord answered, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. One thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the better part. It won't be taken away from her." May God help us to apply these words to our lives. Let it be so. I invite you to take a deep breath with me. Let us breathe in and out. Today we continue our sermon series, Everything in Between, Finding God in the Midst of Extremes. This week we're focused on faith and works. This has been a hot-button topic in the Christian faith for centuries. And part of the issue is that Scripture itself does not agree on how these two things are related. The Apostle Paul, in the letter to Ephesians, says that faith is what saves you, not some action you did. In the letter to James, we hear the author say that the person cannot see your faith apart from your actions, so you have to act. And then you have our text today from the Gospel of Luke, which on the surface seems to suggest that sitting and listening is better than action. And yet I believe if we look closer, I think we'll find something very different. But before we dig deeper, I want to acknowledge the ways this text has been problematic for women. Caroline Lewis, a professor at Luther Seminary, highlights this issue when she writes that this text has forced women to justify their discipleship as either a Mary or a Martha, as if these are the only two ways a woman can live out discipleship. This limits women's faith and ministry and creates stereotypes and scapegoats. Thus, as we reflect on our text today, we will attempt to see beyond this traditional interpretation. Now, our scripture opens with Martha welcoming Jesus as a guest into her home. Unlike the Pharisees in Luke chapter 7, or the Pharisee in Luke chapter 7, who, when Jesus arrived, provided a few gestures of hospitality, Martha sets out to ensure that she is a good host, while Martha's sister, Mary, sits at Jesus' feet and listens to his message. Now, we should anticipate that what is about to happen is not going to go well. As many stories in Scripture talk of sibling rivalries, including Jacob and Esau, where Jacob, the younger brother, steals Esau's birthright, Rachel and Leah, who are married to Jacob and compete to have the most sons. There's Ishmael and Isaac, Joseph and his brothers, and many others. How this rivalry plays out between Mary and Martha depends on how you read what happens next. If you believe that Martha barely knows Jesus, you might imagine that Martha goes up to Jesus while he takes a break from speaking and says, "Lord, don't you care? My sister has left me to take care of everything while she just sits there. Tell her to help me." And Jesus responds, "I'm sorry, Martha, that you're just so distracted. Mary has chosen the better option, and I won't take that from her." If you imagine Martha and Jesus have a close friendship, as the Gospel of John implies, you may read this text more like this. Jesus takes a break from speaking and he goes into the kitchen to find Martha. And Martha's busy running back and forth and says, "Oh, Jesus, there's just so much to do. I've got to get the meat in the oven. I got to set the table. I've got to chop the fruit. I'm sorry, I can't chat as my sister has left me to do everything. Maybe you'll have better luck reminding her of her responsibilities to be a good host." And Jesus responds, "Martha, Martha, take a breath. It's okay. You're distracted by many things. You don't need to do all that. Come sit with your sister." And of course, Martha refuses because someone has to put dinner on the table. The word that our text translates as getting everything ready is often translated as tasks in this text. The actual Greek word is diakonia, which is the root word of the English word deacon. And when scholars translate this word, when men are the focus, it's typically translated as ministry or service. So if we consider that Martha isn't just making dinner or doing tasks, but is providing a ministry, the story changes a bit. Now Martha is doing something very important, but even then, she is getting distracted. And we too get distracted all the time by all kinds of things. Let me give you an example from my own life from the last couple of weeks. Patrick and I decided that we were going to go out to lunch. And on our way to one of our favorite sandwich places, we were having a civil conversation. I can't remember the topic, but I do remember that a certain podcast came up. And I said I would never listen to that podcast. I thought it would not be helpful or meaningful for my work as a pastor. Now, mind you, I have never listened to this podcast before, not even once. But I was pretty sure it would be pointless and unhelpful. Now, Patrick is a very good husband, called me out, and I tried to defend myself, explaining about the kind of podcasts I would find helpful. And he pushed a little more, and I got defensive. This conversation or argument or disagreement, it's hard to name just what it was at the moment, comes up during lunch, on the ride back, and it kind of blows up when we get home. I finally get so irate, so angry, that I have to leave the house. I think I had an errand to run or a kid to pick up. Either way, I left. And as I was driving away, I was beginning to reflect on this conversation, and I realized that I got so defensive because I got hurt. I felt like I was being attacked, even though I know that Patrick was not doing that. But it felt like it, and without much thought, I just did what I always do when I get hurt. I get defensive, I get mad, and it's a way I try to protect myself. But when I do, I no longer can have an honest, curious conversation. I actually stop listening because I'm so distracted by my feelings, by the hurt. Now, we all get distracted. Sometimes it's our feelings that distract us. Sometimes it's other people's expectations of us, or our judgment or of other people, or we get distracted by the little things. Faith communities also get distracted. They can get distracted by the many ministries or outreach opportunities that exist, or the number of ways they can make an impact in their community, or how to fit in one more thing. In churches that are struggling and nearing the end of their life cycle, the number one thing that distracts them is what is happening inside the community. Sometimes this is about finances and paying the bills. Sometimes it's about building issues like maintenance. Other times it looks like conflict with their renters, debates about how and who can use the kitchen, cleaning up after a fellowship time or events, debating how to recruit new volunteers, or internal fights between different members, between the pastor and the community, or between members and staff. Whether we are talking about something personal or communal, Jesus in our text says that we are distracted from the most important thing. And that most important thing is the story of God's love for humanity. For God so loved creation that God called humanity and all creatures good. And God sought a relationship with humanity, but we pulled away. So God sent us prophets like Noah and Moses and Elijah and Elisha and Isaiah and Jeremiah to free us from the burden of sin and to remind us of who and whose we were. But we continue to pull away. So God came to us in the form of a human baby who grew up to be Jesus, who healed people's bodies and souls, gave sight to the blind, befriended the outcast, and liberated the oppressed. He promised us a better life, a life filled with abundance, of wholeness, of joy, of forgiveness, of hope, of kindness and love. In this reality can never be taken from us. For nothing can separate us from the love of God. And yet we get distracted from this truth. The only way to counter our distraction is to stop and reflect. For me, that was taking a drive. For Mary, it was sitting at the feet of Jesus. It is only when we stop and reflect on what is happening within us, within our own community, that we can see what is real, what God is asking of us, what ministry is on the horizon, what next right step we should take, and perhaps, at least for me, what apologies need to be made. But the life of faith is not just reflecting and listening. When we consider that our text follows the story of the man who was robbed and beaten and then helped by a Samaritan, a story that reminds us that being neighborly requires action, then we realize that the life of faith also requires action. It requires doing. It requires us to not only remember God's love, but also to share it. I am reminded of Ecclesiastes chapter 3, where it says, "There is a season for everything, a season for tearing down and building up, for mourning and for dancing. And perhaps there's also a time for being and doing." May we realize what time it is for us, both as individuals and as a community of faith. And may we hear God's voice and feel God's presence